So in this video, I want to talk about some new research which has come out on racial bias in policing. The research was portrayed, I noticed in the media and in the papers themselves, as providing further evidence that there is significant bias against black people. But in fact, I think a correct interpretation of the data in the research provides more evidence against systemic racism against black people. So in the first paper, it's noted in the abstract that a data set was assembled with more than 130 million police traffic stops from 1,400 U.S. counties, and that this was combined with data on the degree of racial prejudice against black people in each of those counties. And what was found is that, quote, disproportionate stopping of black drivers was higher in counties with higher levels of racial prejudice by white residents. Looking into the study, we see in the first place that relative to their local share of county demographics, black drivers were stopped 2.75% more often. And so we're dealing with a pretty small difference to begin with. Turning to the measures of racial prejudice, we see it's a combination of implicit association tests and surveys directly asking people about their preference for one race over the other. We see that the correlations between the degree of disparity at the rate at which black and white people were stopped by police and local racial prejudice were greater the more respondents were in the counties for the measures of racial prejudice, and that the correlations were pretty modest in size, ranging from roughly 0.2 to 0.4. Now, the first important thing that the paper does not mention in the abstract is that they tested these correlations during the daytime and the nighttime and found that the correlations were equally strong in both conditions. This is important because during the nighttime, the race of a driver can't be told by a police officer until that person is pulled over. And so what this shows is that what's going on is not that in areas of greater racial prejudice, the police are more racially prejudiced and so unfairly pulling over more black people when they see them in their cars. Some other explanation has to be given for that correlation. Now, it's obvious also that the reason this test was done in the first place was that they were hoping the correlation would be greater during the daylight, thus giving further evidence for racial bias. But when it didn't come out that way, they just didn't mention it in the abstract, and they don't mention in the text of the research article that this finding invalidates the most intuitive, or what to most people will seem like the most intuitive interpretation of their findings. Moving on from that, to contextualize what I think is the most important finding of this paper, we have to first briefly look at another paper, this Pearson et al. Paper from 2020. This is a paper which has been cited very frequently since it came out as a demonstration that systemic racism exists. And what this paper found, among other things, is that black drivers were more likely to be pulled over right before the sun went down than they were to be pulled over right after the sun went down. And the idea was that that must be because right before the sun goes down, police officers can still see the race of drivers before they're pulled over, and so this is indicative of bias, unfair, racism, that kind of thing. Now, importantly, that was never a valid inference from this veil of darkness test, as it is called. There are lots of other plausible explanations. For instance, black people are more likely than white people to commit various traffic crimes, which are more easily visible during the daylight. For another thing, black people are more heavily represented in suspect lists than white people are, etc. And so there are perfectly fair reasons for which they might be slightly more likely to be pulled over in the daylight than the nighttime. In any case, returning to the new research paper, this was an analysis that was even larger than that 2020 study, which itself was quite large in its sample size. And they found that, quote, our analysis demonstrates that proportions of stopped black drivers in comparison with black county population was lower during daylight than during darkness. Now, it's interesting, if you accept the veil of darkness as a valid measure of racial bias, then this would obviously lead you to conclude that there is a pro-black bias. And in fact, I think this is a valid interpretation because the errors and flaws with the veil of darkness test all kind of lean in one direction. That is to say that they could make you infer that racism was present when none was, when finding that black drivers were being pulled over more during the daylight. But because there are fewer plausible alternative explanations for why it is they would get pulled over less often during the daylight, I think this is a stronger piece of evidence for a pro-black bias than the opposite finding would be evidence for an anti-black bias. The last thing I'll say about this is that I think it's worth emphasizing that the studies that have been done on this in the past have large enough sample sizes that we know that these aren't flukes, and that what's going on here is that there are some areas of the United States in which black people are more likely to get pulled over during the daylight, some areas where there's no difference, and some areas where they're less likely to be pulled over during the daylight. And up to this point, the largest analysis done has found that on net in the United States, the bias leans in a pro-black direction. The second paper I want to talk about has very similar findings. They say that they, quote, found that black-white traffic stop disparities are associated with county-level implicit and explicit racial attitudes, and that this association is attributable to racial demographics. Counties with a higher proportion of white residents had larger racial disparities in police traffic stops. They also note that they examined racial disparities in several post-stop outcomes, for instance, arrest rates, and found that they were not systemically related to racial attitudes, despite evidence of disparities. So across their data set, they found that for every 100 driving age black residents in a neighborhood, 101 black drivers would be arrested over a 5-year period, and that the corresponding number for white drivers over a 5-year period was 71 out of 100. Like I said, they related this to racial attitudes in the local area. I'm not going to dwell on that because the previous study already showed that that association exists, but that a simple causal interpretation of that relationship is invalid for reasons I previously discussed. I do want to talk about some of their post-stop outcomes, though. So in terms of arrests, they found that per 100 drivers, there were 2.05 arrests in the case of black drivers and 1.21 arrests per 100 in the case of white drivers, and that per 100 stopped drivers, among black people, 2.84 were searched, and among white people, that number was 1.38. So these numbers indicate a very large difference in relative terms, but a very small difference in absolute terms. It was also found that the hit rate, meaning the rate at which police searches actually turned up illegal material, the hit rate was 32% for black drivers and 34% for white drivers. Now, this hit rate comparison was sometimes used in the past as a measure of racial bias, but as this paper notes, there's a problem having to do with probability distributions, sometimes called the problem of inframarginality, which invalidates that test as a test of bias. As social scientists have become more aware of the invalidity of that test, they have moved to something called the threshold test, which is an attempt to measure the minimum threshold probability of having criminal material at which someone will be searched and how that varies by race. And so this paper estimated that for black drivers, there had to be at least a 21% chance of them having criminal material for them to be searched. But for white drivers, that threshold was 23%, indicating a degree of bias. The problem with this inference is that, as is noted in that Pearson 2020 paper that I looked at before that was comparing stop rates by daylight and no daylight, that is also the paper which popularized this threshold test, and they note that, quote, if officers disproportionately suspect more serious criminal activity when searching black and Hispanic drivers compared to white drivers, then lower observed thresholds may stem from non-discriminatory police practices. Now we can look at this paper by Everett and someone with a last name I'm not even going to begin to try to say, and it shows us what many other papers will show us. This is not a controversial finding in the slightest, that in fact, black and Hispanic criminals are systematically sentenced for more serious crimes than are white criminals. And what this means, of course, is that the slightly higher threshold being used for white drivers than black drivers or Hispanic drivers is what you would expect if police were operating rationally given the actual racial differences in criminal behavior. Hopefully it is obvious that it is ridiculous to try to measure some kind of unfair racial bias using a test which is going to tell you the police are being racist, even when they're just acting in accordance with objective differences between the groups. Now, I also want to highlight the fact that the paper found that, quote, we find some evidence that black stopped drivers were arrested less often relative to white stopped drivers in counties of relatively anti-black and pro-white attitudes. In terms of those threshold disparities I was just talking about, those vary by region, and they also looked at what predicts that variance across regions, and they found the answer to that is not implicit or explicit attitudes about race. And so from this, I think we can draw one of three conclusions. Either the measures being used of implicit and explicit prejudice are crap, or more prejudiced police officers don't arrest or search black people more on account of that racism, maybe because they've been trained to not act on those impulses even if they have them. Or we'll conclude that more racist general populations do not lead to more racist police officers because the screening process for police officers is sufficiently good to stop any serious racially biased people, at least behaviorally biased people, in the sense of their bias leading to prejudiced behavior as opposed to just thoughts, actually getting into the police force. No matter which of those conclusions we draw, I think we either have to say that these papers provide no meaningful evidence about systemic racism or provide evidence against systemic racism. I should also mention that there's a sense in which these findings don't even seem logically coherent, because it doesn't make sense to say that there are areas where black people are pulled over more and that the evidence threshold used to search black people is lower than that of white people, but those same areas are not areas in which black people are actually searched more or arrested more. Right? Those things seemingly can't all be true. And I think that fact should significantly lower our certainty in any conclusion we want to draw, specifically from the use of racial prejudice measures in these papers. And so to summarize, black people are not pulled over more during the day when the race of a driver is visible to police. Measures, plausibly very imperfect measures of racial animus against black people, do not predict the degree to which black people are, relative to white people, arrested or searched by police in an area. These measures of animus do predict the rate at which black people are pulled over by police, but this is equally true when police can and cannot see the race of the driver prior to pulling them over. And a slightly lower evidence threshold being used to search black people is expected because black criminals on average commit more serious crimes than white criminals do, and more serious crimes justify lower evidence thresholds. Anyway, that's the video. Consider liking or commenting if you enjoyed it, and in any case, thanks for watching.